Yeah.
Just for quick context, I put the questions in the chat here.
Yeah. I saw them. You can direct me to a great script at any point.
My gosh, I mean, it's like the brand piece. Maybe just we could start there because this is an endless fascinating topic to me of, what is a higher education brand and what sort of differentiates it from other industries and why is it unique? I think your firm has done
Right.
such a good job of like tackling that and doing it from both that sort of like high level perspective of like here's your overarching sort of brand strategy, but then you get really deep on tactics. So can you just like conceptualize like and maybe sort of center us around like how you think about higher education brand and some of the sort of like intersecting components
Yeah.
of that?
Yeah. I think the way that schools have to think about their brand and reputation, it's incredibly important and it's also really diverse across all of these different types of schools. The way that a community college is thinking about it, a liberal arts institution, a big R1, a mid-tier regional comprehensive, they're all different. For me, I like to sometimes sub in the word or the idea of sort of the value proposition of the school in lieu of brand, because when we're doing enrollment strategy, when we're doing financial sustainability, I think if we're thinking about what is our unique or somewhat unique value proposition to prospective students for this program and for this program and for this program, it helps to really define what we're doing and to think about the right strategy for helping a program, a school, or an institution as a whole grow. So if you are if your bread and butter is on ground, traditional first time freshman coming in, like you're a liberal arts institution, you've been touting these incredibly great um, dynamics around faculty and students and small classrooms, and you've been doing it for 100 years at a beautiful campus. When you're thinking then about what is my value proposition, you have to maintain that. And a lot of maintaining that is whatever you do in terms of financial sustainability, you're doing it around in partnership with your faculty. That is to say, if you do it in such a way where the faculty come away and say, wow, this school is going off the deep end. I don't want to be a part of this, or faculty are such a different conundrum in higher ed. I mean that in the best possible way, because you don't see it in other industries where you have this shared governance and you have the folks that are part and parcel of your value proposition raising their hand very publicly and saying, we should be doing things different than what I'm seeing, president or provost do. Which is all to say, if you're going to think about financial sustainability for your school, you have to think about the value proposition, and your faculty and your staff are part and parcel with it in a way that isn't true, I think, in other institutions. And it means that if you're facing this big structural deficit and you're trying to figure out how do I do this, I don't think you can go about bringing an operating deficit down in 1 year or two just by hacking away programs, and especially not by hacking away tenure track faculty. And I could say all faculty, but I think the thing that really becomes important there is that when you are declaring exigency or something like exigency, which is the language in some of the codes, you're sort of breaking a promise to faculty in doing that. There are other alternatives, though, and I think it's not easy, but I think there are ways to bring faculty along, to bring provosts along in a spirit of academic innovation and say, look, if we are going to evolve as a school, if we're going to get through to the other side of this where we are very much financially sustainable, we're going to have to do this together. And we're going to have to do it in a way that preserves the brand and reputation for the school. Because at the point where you can no longer ask parents and prospective students to pay X amount, and you're discounting it 70, 75%, which, as I have said before, is in my mind sort of, it's not the magic number, but it's the cliff. It's the point at which our phone starts to ring and schools say, hey, we think we've got a structural problem here and we need to sort this out. At that point, thinking about your value proposition and how you can maintain that value proposition through academic innovation, through thinking about what are the programs of the future. They are adjacent and complementary and include all the things you're offering now, but you've got to be able to speak to it in the parlance of your prospective students. And if you don't do that, then you might have a great value proposition, but you're not communicating it well. And if you're not communicating it well, you can't then go out there and say, we're raising tuition by 2 or 3%, and our scholarships are going to get down to a more reasonable level. If you don't do that, I think you can end up with what I will say candidly to clients is a death spiral. you cut programs, you hinder reputation, you hurt your brand, and then you can't get those students to come the next year because they've seen it in the headlines, they've seen it in Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle or the local paper, or they see it on Google, which is where they're going to get their information first and foremost. And then they say, wow, that doesn't seem like a school where I want to go and spend X amount of money for 4 years for a credential that I think is damaged. So I think that idea of brand has to be at the middle of whatever you're doing, whatever initiative you're doing to try to get an institution back on track.
I couldn't agree more. You mentioned a few intersecting components there, and this is just such a. I appreciate how you conceptualize that, because this is just such a complicated beast, right? There's so many
Yeah.
intersecting pieces. I think it's unique from other industries for a lot of the dynamics that you mentioned. Two really interesting sort of like components that you brought up were faculty and boards. And one thing that like I think there's is like I haven't been able to fully wrap my mind around is like how different board psychology will look at different institutions.
Yeah.
Similar institutions with sort of similar things. So, for instance, one of my clients recently has had a growing structural deficit. And
Mm-hmm.
without giving hard numbers, I would say in the 2 years that have been sort of known them a little bit and worked with them a touch, it's doubled, and
Mm-hmm.
it's significant, is what I would
Yeah.
say. The board is not worried about it at all. I think they see this as sort of this infrastructure sort of investment. There's a few sort of people on it that I think are bringing up appropriate concerns, but including the finance committee is just like, well, we need to sort of weather the storm. And then on the flip
Yeah.
side of that, we right before we hit record, we had this really interesting conversation around some of the sort of 401s and really wealthy liberal arts colleges that are well positioned endowments and cash flow and all those pieces that are really freaking out about some of the sort of potential implications of like. So can you talk a little bit about the sort of intersecting variables that you have with faculty and board and like the impact on
Mm-hmm.
brand and what that means for sort of value
Yeah.
proposition for target market?
Yeah, it's really interesting. If we're working with a private institution, what we are seeing more and more are board members. They're deeply devoted to the institution, but you will of course have one or two or more that when you see 2 and then 3 and then 4 years of structural deficits, those folks raise their hand. It's the guy that runs the PE firm or the investment shop that does numbers for a living and says this is not the way that we should go. And what I have found, and what we found over, a good handful of these types of initiatives in the last year and a half, is that bringing that board together is bringing them together around a plan that is realistic and pragmatic. And you have to, in a lot of those cases, prove it. What we are encountering sometimes is those boards are seeing the projections and the forecast change. So it's been a couple of years. There were rosy forecasts that didn't take into account all the things that we know are happening. It's the demographic cliff, it's the SAI change, it's whatever, it's the competition, it's the big state schools, sucking students away from, liberal arts colleges here and there, whatever it might be. But getting to a point where all of the trustees over here, all of the trustees over here, the administration, the leadership, the VP for enrollment, the CFO, and the budget person can all look at one set of numbers and say, I agree. That is a plan that works. That becomes both the challenge and the opportunity, I think, in working with those particular boards. But you have to get to the point where you're able to open up that financial model, if you will, and have, in some cases, really hard discussions with folks, whether it's a VP for enrollment over here, or sometimes it's a provost thinking about where do you take the academic enterprise. There are huge levers to be pulled. That is, there are all sorts of places, both on the revenue and expense side, where any of these institutions need to be looking. But when you get to a point where you can say, look, I want to pull these 7 levers, but not this one. These enrollment forecasts feel right. These forecasts around tuition discounting are actually achievable. We think we can do this in terms of a top end tuition price increase. And we're willing to spend X amount more dollars of, you can think of it as one-time money, to get through past this deficit. And as you were saying, get to the other side where we are back into the black and we are growing and we feel good about our sort of prospectus for whether it's growth or just sustainability, it's there. But it comes down to that plan that everybody can agree on. If there's distrust about the forecasts that have come before and there's not a clear sense of how to proceed forward, that's where I think boards and leadership get crosswise, especially in that private sense. Now, you move to the public sphere. The next question I'm going to ask you is, what state are you in?
Okay.
And what I've seen in the last decade is the nature of appointees to a lot of state institutions have really changed.
Mm.
It's changed the nature of our work, whereby, um, for better or worse, the presentations we're making to gubernatorially appointed board members in various states have to be really thoughtful. There are places of great agreement. If you are talking about growth and workforce development, and you're talking about affordability, and you're thinking about even academic innovation to the point where you are going to help an institution meet the labor needs for a state in the future, you're in a great spot. And there's a lot of great opportunity of coming together of boards that are bipartisan, they're purple boards or whatever you want to call them. That becomes more important in those conversations sometimes than kind of thinking about how a school is going to proceed. Because I will say, with those types of schools, we're not having the financial sustainability conversations quite as much, because in part because so much of the way that they are bringing in revenues is on the state appropriations side. And that is a absolutely political process. Knock on wood, for most of our clients, state appropriations have been really solid and growing for almost 9 years now, a few stragglers aside. That is going to change in a few states. I think I was reading about Florida just yesterday, and that will change the way that both we are working with public school boards and the way that those institutions are working with their boards as well.
Yeah. Yeah. You'd maybe pivot back to something you said earlier around the sort of death spiral, which is something just very, very real. I love the way you encapsulated it.
We don't usually put that in the slides because it tends to scare people, but it's a concept that you learn about in your management accounting class,
Yeah.
that is pervasive across all sorts of industries. I don't know that higher ed really knows that language, but they know exactly what it looks like. Essentially, the idea of cutting yourself to death.
Yeah, and we see it pretty regularly, and it's really unfortunate when you sort of catch it like 18 months when somebody's at that critical period where it's like if they do X and they do Y and they do these things really sort of thoughtfully,
Yeah,
they can weather this storm. Like maybe have 1 to 2 years of sort of like really sort of like tight margins, et cetera, but then really sort of come out in the black. But you don't see them sort of execute or sort of make the right moves at the right time. To you, if somebody's sort of in that, maybe let's do a pre and post, right? Like what are the preventative measures? What are the levers that you're pulling when they're at that
yeah.
cliff and need to make some critical decisions? And then God forbid they're on the other side of that. Like what's the sort of tactics and strategies that you all are sort of unrolling?
Yeah. Yeah. The pre side is a lot better to work on.
So much better.
You're in situations where you've just talked to the CFO, between cash on hand and sort of liquid or near liquid type of reserves, endowments that are unrestricted, and even restricted endowments that you think you could get to if you really had to. If you add all those things up, you can say, look, I've got 12 years of running this deficit. That's your runway. And if you're in that situation, if you've got 10 years, if you've got 8 years, all of these things I think are very accomplishable. At 5 years, you start to get really nervous. At 2 years, you're post, which rhymes with toast. Kind of funny. But at 2 years, you are doing the things that I think make you are going to have a definitive change in the way that you operate, because there's no other way about it. But when you're pre, then I think I would point any of those institutions to the idea of academic innovation. That is rationalizing which degrees you offer and where and how many faculty you have. It's not a fun thing because you're talking about tenure track jobs, but you have to embrace the idea that you should and can have time on your side, which is all to say. And, I come from a family of English professors that were all tenured and that sort of thing. You've got to understand what you can afford to do and teach at what level. What's your faculty student ratio for all the classes that are a part of your gen ed and whatever it might be? If you don't have to think about that, great. That means that your brand is up here, your reputation's up here, and you can do all these things. We're at the point though where we have said, okay, we're running a structural deficit. We've got 8 years or 10 years. The great part about 8 years or 10 years is that if you just look at retirements natural attrition, sort of gradual sort of evolution in all of these different disciplines and curriculums, you can get there. And if you bring the faculty on board, it can be an okay process. I'm never going to promise it'll be a great one, but it needs to be an okay process. This is your number one thing, because this is 60% of the cost in the institution. And when that gets out of whack, when you can't find the faculty you need to teach the courses where the demand has shifted, and you have too many faculty for the courses where there's not any demand, but you've got contracts, you've got tenure with these folks. What you really need then is time to get yourself out of that situation in the best way and to really innovate to where the students want to go, where the labor markets want to go, where your board might want you to go. And that should be true. I remember reading this book, Jefferson's Education. It was mostly about Thomas Jefferson and William and Mary and then UVA. But what struck me is what the first six faculty were at UVA back in 1819 or 1824, whatever year it was, when they were actually started hiring and bringing in these folks from Europe. And they had six faculty. And if UVA just still had the six faculty, I don't think they would be doing as well. Academic innovation has been with us for 200 some years. I'm sitting here in Charlottesville, Virginia, so that's part of the reason I think about UVA sometimes. Mm-hmm. Innovation and change in what we offer and how we offer it is, part and parcel of every single discipline that a school offers now. The way they taught English in 1850 is drastically different than the way they taught English in 2000, and the way that they're probably going to be teaching English in 2050, if I had to guess. And I think everybody would generally agree with that. So that the pre-part, the first thing is big, but hopefully very virtuous academic innovation planning and trying to figure out, what am I going to offer and to how many students in 5 or 10 years? And then working backwards from that to figure out, okay, how do I teach that and how do I deliver a world-class education around that? The next thing I think you're thinking about for most of these schools that are actually asking this question is enrollments and tuition discounting. And they go hand in hand. Now, if they've already gone down the road of what I sometimes refer to as alternative revenues, meaning you've launched new grad programs, you've launched non-degree, you've gone out and gotten big in workforce development, whatever it might be, tuition discounting is sometimes in those, but not as often. But for many of the schools that are calling us, this is a question of, how did I let my tuition discounting for the majority of these students get to where it is now, which is where at 60, 65, 70%. And how do I recover from this? And, you probably know this, but I think a lot of people outside of higher ed don't realize that the average freshman walking into at least the group of private institutions that fills out the NACUBO survey each year is now getting 55% off the sticker price. And again, that's the average of that group. I think it's the median of that group, if I'm recalling. It goes up like clockwork, 1% to 1.5% almost every year. I've done that webinar with Ken Red at NACUBO a couple of times. And I remember coming back 3 years later and said, yes, I'm really using the same slides as I did 3 years ago because nothing changed. We all are marching forward in this sort of zero-sum game of pricing and discounting, where all of these liberal arts colleges have not figured out a way. They're using the exact same type of matrix from one of the 2 or 3 really big tuition discounting providers, and they are eating themselves alive, and they haven't figured out a way out. So when I was talking a little earlier about getting everybody in the room and saying, is this realistic? What we find sometimes is the hardest conversation there is with a VP for enrollment that says, there is no way I can bring in a class like this and bring tuition discounting down. Maybe sometimes they are right, but most of the time they are practicing what I call pretty clumsy tuition discounting. It is the exact same across all of these different vendors. Full disclosure, we do tuition discounting for about a dozen schools a year, not 120, but it's part and parcel of doing financial sustainability now. That is the hardest conversation, not the faculty side, not the provost side, but for a VP for enrollment or a head of admissions that thinks there's no way out of 70% discounting. That's the hardest conversation, because the next line in that conversation with the president, the provost, and everybody else in the room is, there's no way out if you can't stop it from going forward. It sounds glib, but I've said it in lots of president's cabinet meetings. There is no revenue at 100% discounting. And I say it kind of to get a laugh, but it's also true. We've got a real sort of frog in the frying pan problem. It was 35% 25 or 30 years ago. It was in the mid 40s when I started doing the webinar with Kevin Red, like back in 2016. And now it's at 55%, which means that the high end of that distribution are schools at 75% who do not know their way out of that. And now, only now is it clear they have to find their way out of it. And the question is, to where you started here, Mike, are they pre or post? Do they have 8 years of runway? Because if they do, they can get out of it. If they don't have 8 years of runway or 6 years of runway, their hands are really tied there, because what they have to do, and switching over to the post side, is if they don't have runway, if they don't have enough sort of liquid reserves in one way, shape, or form, then you are drastically shrinking the size of what you offer in programs. Your ratios and how you teach and all these things has to get essentially really cheap, really fast. You're cutting away all of the other sort of perks and amenities of being a student. Anything that's fringe, that's nice to have, is gone. And you're just trying to survive. But of course, in doing all of that, you make the headlines and people say, wow, this school is about to go under. And that's where the brand and reputation goes in, because at the point where somebody, a prospective student, a 17-year-old, it could be a 23-year-old thinking of a grad program, at the point where you're not sure if that credential that might hang on your wall someday is going to be around, that's a really tough investment decision to make. Should I pay $80,000, $100,000, $200,000 for a diploma where 10 years from now somebody's going to say, I've never heard of that school, and your response is, that's because they're not around anymore? You are thinking about it. The only way out of that is a sort of a complete model change, where you go to being a really low cost institution. And you and that is exactly where you're going. And you're going to all the places where you can do that. But a lot of institutions, I would say most institutions, are not capable of that change. If you were built as a BMW or even just a really nice Honda, you are not ready to be the Ford Fit
No. I mean, like,
of higher ed
your
institutions.
marketing is going to look so
Yeah.
different, like your value proposition and like who your clientele, like you're just not really sort of built the conversations that you need to sort of be a little bit more vocational. Like all those pieces are just like very, very different.
Yeah.
You mentioned such a sort of interesting sort of factor around the discounting. Like, what's the relationship that you see between like net student revenue? Because this is like a real challenge that I see, like in a butting
Yeah.
of heads between, like, you've got your VP of admissions, you've got your board and your president, and they're having this sort of discount conversation around the sort of like this net student revenue, and the board is like saying, hey, we're discounting too high. The person is just like, exactly what you said, like what's that relationship and dynamic looking, and like what's the intersecting
Yeah.
piece with brand there? Because I feel like that's an
Yeah.
interesting thing that tease out.
Yeah, I think, and where we've seen this be successful, is you have to get to a place where that entire room of board members, president's cabinet, VP for enrollment, understand just how challenging both the enrollment market is and tuition discounting is to get right. And they have to get beyond the basics, I would argue, to understand why we got here. Because there's what you're asking in that moment, if you think there's no return on tuition discounting, meaning if you think, I know we're at 70%, but we can't go to 75, like we cease to exist at 75%, it puts an inordinate amount of pressure on the VP for enrollment. And if they shoulder that pressure by themselves, they don't want that job, and it's kind of impossible. So I've looked several presidents straight in the eye and say, you have to own this. It is a giant risk, it would seem, to say we are going to enroll the same number or more students, or maybe just a little bit less, but we are going to essentially raise prices or raise net prices in the way that we do discounting, because there's not another way out of it. And that has to be on the president. And then it has to be supported by the board. And again, you have to see the math in one plan that everybody can agree on. And if you don't have that, you don't have a resolution to this, because absent that conviction and absent that agreement from the board and the president and the provost and the CFO, a VP for enrollment and everybody that's on their team are going to do the things that are the least risky.
Mm-hmm.
The least risky thing to do is to bring in the right number of students. Okay. If the president says, I need 400 students, or the board says we got to have 400 students, then, and there are no parameters and no caveats, then that VP for enrollment is going to say, great, no matter what, I'm going to bring in 400 students. But that's a short-term play. That is not a long-term pricing integrity play. But if that's the number one thing, I'm going to discount the heck out of the students at the end of that funnel.
Mm.
And as that funnel and that tail of students gets thinner and thinner, the discounts go up and up. The last few students that you get to make the class are in the 90s, or they're full ride, because it's better to apologize for a rising tuition discount rate than missing your class by 10% or 15%. Because look, the campus looks empty. It's not great. And so for a lot of these schools, you have to bring everybody together and say, look, enrollment is not just the domain of this VP for enrollment. Facilities has a role. That building that's right across from admissions has to look beautiful. The $1 Million Walk has to be a $1 Million Walk. Faculty have a role to play. If the feedback loop isn't that this is a phenomenal place to learn and the faculty care, if the faculty are going into the classroom angry about the state of affairs at the institution, that's probably not a quality learning experience. All the oars have to be moving in the same direction at the same time if you're going to achieve that trifecta of great things, which is I want more students and I want lower discounting, and I want to do it all with my brand and reputation intact. And you can look at other ways around it. And part of that brand and reputation, a lot of times the third part of the trifecta is student quality.
Sure.
We don't want to just let in everyone. But I would argue that if you're going to do one of those things, you need to start letting in students that you might have not otherwise. And that, by and large, for the clients that we're seeing in this sort of financial sustainability in that type of project, that ship has sailed. They are already coming down. They wouldn't have sniffed the 1200 SAT 10 years ago, and now that's fantastic. Here's 50% off. But everybody in that board meeting, in that cabinet meeting, has to be on the same page. Because again, if it's not clear that has to happen as part of the plan, then the only thing left in the plan to do is really draconian cost reductions. And then I think you're hitting brand and reputation in a way that you likely cannot sustain if you're built in a certain way as an institution.
Completely.
Again, if you've been a beautiful Honda Accord or a BMW for many years, I don't think you're becoming, the lowest cost Chinese EV on the market, that sort of thing.
Completely. Well,
It's hard.
And I think that's a great segue into how do you one bias that I have of somebody that sort of parlays and touches marketing in a number of different industries is that it's seemingly like so many places are saying the exact same thing, right? Like the value proposition that they're offering, they don't see it as commoditized, because when you sort of talk to them and you say what's unique about you, you get the same four answers. Oh, we have individualized, education.
Yes.
We have a community. We have these kind of pieces, but so that nuance is just really sort of not there, and nobody's really owning a category or creating this super niche part of the pie and signaling to the right kind of people in the right kind of way. This is who we are.
Yes.
How do you all do that with some of the sort of intersecting variables? Because it's complicated, right? Faculty, students, alums, trustees, everyone has a very different idea about what this place is and what they're doing. And how do you square the circle on that?
Yeah, I had this great conversation. It was the whole of the president's cabinet of this awesome client, awesome school in Pennsylvania. And they had aspects of this issue. And the president said something along the lines of, we have got to bring the message of what makes us special and unique and what our value proposition is. And we have to do it in a really big way. And you're right. Elements that you just mentioned are sprinkled in lots of these sort of mission statements, value statements. A lot of them are true. And then what I think the really innovative schools do well that are in this particular situation is they say, what's the theme around this? What else in there is really unique? So you take individualized learning, maybe a new way of delivering it, maybe a different combination or a different sets of expertise in the curriculum. So saying we have a program like nobody else has, and it is so germane to this particular industry that it will make sense for certain students. That is, you find your niche. I think that is there for a lot of schools. I think a lot of schools probably get 70 or 80% of the way there when
Yes.
they are undertaking this. But then they don't stick the landing. And the landing is this. The landing is you can't keep that a secret, and you can't keep doing the admissions part the way that you've done for the last 5 years. So I think the schools that have done this well are already spending a lot of money on brand and reputation. And it is where their students and some of the parents are. It is in Google Ads. It is in finding their way into all the places that parents and students get information about these schools. And then the interesting thing, so there's I've told this to some clients, I think the right approach right now in getting this message out is a little bit of new school and a little bit of old school.
Yeah.
Is everything I just said. It's, do you have a really great ad campaign in all of the digital areas where you think you can make hay?
Mm-hmm.
Are you spending your money wisely? And are you getting this message out here? Not only that you are this institution in this niche, but you're finding that niche in a digital world. So you're finding that high school student that really wants to learn about robotics, but also study ethics too. And because that's what they're going to Google when they're trying to figure out, well, I don't know, mom. Well, I don't know where I want to go to school. Can you win that piece of real estate in Google that is so specific to you and your brand and your value proposition? Then the old school way, which is also dropped off, is when your admissions counselors and your faculty and your leadership are out in the world. Are they bringing that same message? Are they on script in a very good way? I don't want people to sound like robots, and are you actually doing the work? And I say that last part because what we have found at a lot of schools where admissions has fallen off, the visits are down.
Yeah.
And they get canceled a lot. Counselors aren't doing it. And that's the old school way. But that is one of the few places now where you can actually have a conversation with a prospective student and win them to your side. And the interesting feedback loop here is from the guidance counselors, admissions counselors at the high schools that say, we don't see this school anymore. Because what happened over the last 20 years, in addition to the sort of the siren song of tuition discounting, is that we spent our money on name buying like never before. And we had new offerings in that market, and we got it's easy, right?
Yes.
I just write this big old check to somebody, and I pay X number of cents per lead, and sometimes more. And 15 years ago, that worked. But these students now are applying, if they are part of the student that you might get through name buying, they're applying to 12 or 15 schools in some of these cases. So your a priori odds of enrolling them, your yield expected for one of those has fallen. It's not 15% anymore. It used to be 15% for some of these schools. It's like less than 1% that you're going to get on those. You are literally tossing money down the drain if that is your number one way of bringing in students. And when you do that, you don't really get that targeted approach of bringing your brand and reputation to that prospective student. And so you're just setting money on fire in some of those cases. I'm not saying it's wrong in all cases, but if you can't be targeted, geo-fenced, specific, and nuanced in the way you're thinking about marketing communications to prospective students, you're missing the boat. And then the second thing I'd say is, if you do become advanced in this and you are really good at this, the next thing you are going to want to do is be that institution that is driven by really great data about prospective students and their behavior and engagement with you. And that means that you really have your CRM game down, that you can handle an inquiry, a lead, an application, whatever it is, you can nurture it. And these are all the new terms. I mean, they're 10 years old now, whatever it is. But if your institution isn't operating that way within enrollment on all of the programs that you have, you're missing out right now on all the data about those students and about the way they interact with you prior to admission. That is the thing that you're going to want to use to get even better at yielding students. So that's the very long story of saying how do you bring that brand and reputation to them? A lot of schools I think are there with the message, but the delivery they miss. And even if they do deliver it right, you then have to know how to listen the right way for the feedback from those students to saying this is working.
There's so much there to respond to. It's just doing a little bit of the sort of digital adscape in general. It's amazing to me like how many places don't really have a nuanced digital strategy or can't really sort of speak to exactly like what keywords you buy in, what's your geofencing thing, what's your Instagram strategy, like how are you leveraging data and insights from your retention and who's retaining. Like there's so
Yeah.
many super targeted things you can do sort of around interest and what your student profile looks like and who's succeeding there. Like you can grab all of this data, input it, and you can target so specifically and then sort of comprehensively like map that to your on the ground strategies, your boots on the ground, your visits, like all those pieces. But it's incredible to me like how many places are just missing little pieces of it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the unfortunate thing is like like you if you have 70 to 80% of like the thing dialed in, you're probably only going to get like 30 to 40% of the apps of the place that has 100, right? Like you're just going to lose in so many ways. So I love the point you made
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's an interesting it's an interesting new dynamic. It's not that new, but it's for some schools that are struggling, it has to be the new dynamic.
Yeah, how do you think about the retention side of it and like recruiting and signaling to the right students, knowing that enrollment is just like so clutch and so so key to
Yeah.
what you're doing?
Yeah, I think that becomes sort of the next domino for a lot of these schools. You're thinking about this big plan that everybody can buy into that brings you back to financial sustainability, or you've just told your VP for enrollment that you have, maybe a bit of a paradigm shift or a big paradigm shift in the way that you want them to do admissions operations and recruiting and things like that because enrollments are slipping, discounting's going up, whatever it might be. And then you realize, exacerbated by lots of different things, that the students that you're losing uh, are also going up. And we've worked with a couple schools this year where in a single year, retention went from 82 to 73%. And we don't quite know why, or the school doesn't quite know why until you get in there and start pulling it apart. I mean, some of it is, and this is very common for liberal arts colleges, private colleges, 30 or 40% of their student population sometimes are athletes. And athletes, especially in a good number of sports. I mean, we've worked with schools that have 30, 35 different sports. They're transferring everywhere because the NCAA has changed the rules. Now, that's not the whole story in retention. There are still the very classic narratives, I think, around students that come in and leave for reasons of sort of academics or finances or academics multiplied by finances. There's always going to be a part of the population you lose because of the sort of personal dynamics. They're too far away from home, things like that. But there have been other things exacerbating retention for a lot of these schools. What I think is really interesting is that technology has given us a lot of new tools, or at least new data, to tell us the biggest and best ways to think about whether a student's likely to stay. And if you know that, you can start to mitigate this. But I am not convinced that the majority of schools are thinking about that data in the right way. So let me give you an example. I don't think that as many schools as should are using student location and student attendance data
Mhm.
to try to be their number one tracker of whether or not a student's about to leave. If a student stops going to class, you are getting ghosted. And you've got to figure out a way to identify that and get your early warning system going. Now, you can spend easily $250,000 a year on any of the really big technologies that do this. And you might not get to that because they are trying to look at what I call the middle of the retention problem, which is finding students that aren't doing as well academically because they're predisposed to not doing as well academically. And then you create just a robust early warning system. I think at the early end of that, at the minimum, again, this comes back to your CRM game. I think an early warning system is great and a system to start gathering data on your students and engagement behavior, because you're going to want it later to put in an even more robust system. But if you're not doing that, if you don't have something on your campus where it raises a flag and says somebody needs to walk out and talk to that person, You can do that. And you don't have to spend $250,000.
No.
If you're already running Slate and you're paying $50,000 a year for Slate, you can add that on to Slate. It's not a Slate specific thing. It's actually something we do, I will say. But you don't have to spend $250,000 to get that basic early warning system set up in a lower cost CRM. It's not like $1 million Salesforce build, and it's not like a Navigate play
Mhm.
where you've got that long installation time or whatever it is. I think schools have to look at that, because if you want to go from A to B, which is just the basics of retention and early warning, you don't have to break the bank. But then the interesting thing is, if you can set that up, you can own and run your own retention system. You can innovate on it. You can do your own data science on it. And again, you don't have to spend $250,000, $500,000, $1 million a year on technology that's built for everyone. You can build your own technology on what you already have installed for a lot less. And I think that's the way that at least the schools that we're working with need to go, because these are not schools that are ready to write a giant check right now and do it every year. They don't need another $250,000 or $500,000 expense item in their budgets.
Mhm.
They are looking for the opposite of that right now. But if they can say, I'm on a pathway to not figuring out what works for me in retention, because I'm starting to get the data and I'm doing the very basics of early warning, and I'm doing it in a way that I can understand and I can analyze the data, you're covering a huge
Yes.
percentage of the retention problem just in doing that, is my take. And you're doing it yourself. So you will understand what makes retention work at your school, not a third party outsourcer.
Yeah, it's really easy to overcomplicate an early warning system, a tracking system that you have for any of these pieces, or even what your retentional model actually looks like. Whereas, like I think in my experience, the most part, you could have 4 or 5 levers that you're pushing, and easy sort of tracking
Yeah.
mechanisms that are sort of giving push notifications or whatever to the right kind of people to reach out to the student, and that's actually going to go relatively.
Yeah. Yeah. We're entering an age of data science and sort of advanced computation, whereby I would say that for most schools, they should be the owner and the engineer of understanding the data and the reasons why students leave their institution. They shouldn't have to outsource that real soon. I was replying on a blog yesterday about predictive analytics software for enrollments, and saying, if you're thinking about using AI, it's close. It's not all the way there
Yep.
yet, but data science by itself, I think, will get you the rest of the way there. But if it's the right time to look around and say, in 5 years, how do I want to be analyzing my data around student retention? And how can I do that in the most efficient way possible?
Yeah. Well said. I know that we're a little over time here. Ben, where can people find you and where can they get in touch?
Sure. The easiest way to kind of see what we do and where we do is on our website, kennedyandcompany.com. I know right there, I think on the front of the website is also all the conferences that we're heading to. It's the beginning of conference season, if you will. I'm going to Denver for UPSIA
Hmm.
in a couple of weeks, along with 3 or 4 other folks. I know that a bunch of our folks are going to the Salesforce Higher Ed Conference this week or next week. And I know we're doing the Slate Summit, of course, in June. I think we are at Nakubo this year. And, we love conversations with prospective clients. There's a lot out there. And we also try to find ways that clients can help themselves, because most of our clients are not behemoths with that $6 billion endowment, like I started at the beginning. There are schools that are trying to find their way out of a tough situation, and we want to be there to help them and do it in a way that's not salesy and high pressure. And so if this was an interesting conversation for anybody, we'd love to have a follow up, not to try to sell you something, but to see if we can be helpful, even if it's, because that first piece of advice is, how can you start solving this yourself in a period of time with a lot of uncertainty?
Yeah, that's incredibly well said. I think a great place to end it. Ben, thank you. I appreciate you.
Yeah. No, it's my pleasure, Mike. It's great to talk with you, and we'll have to do it again sometime. Yeah.
Absolutely.